Dale Pruitt said later that he heard the Cimarron before he heard anything else that night, and that the sound it made was nothing like a river. He said it sounded like freight, like something with tonnage behind it moving at speed across flat ground with no intention of stopping. He had lived on the basin's east quarter for 2 years and had heard the Cimarron in every mood it possessed: the low winter murmur, the spring quickening, the summer drop that left sandbars exposed and crawfish visible in the shallows, and none of those sounds had prepared him for what came through his cabin wall at 8:30 on an April evening, while his wife was mending by the stove and his children were already in bed. Harlan Boggs heard it too, but Harlan was not surprised. He was eating salt pork at his table when the ground moved. Not violently, not the way ground moves in an earthquake, with noise and spectacle and the kind of drama that gives a man time to understand what is happening. It moved the way ground moves when it has been holding something back for a long time and has finally decided to stop. A slow, lateral shift beneath the cabin floor, maybe 2 inches of travel, maybe 3, that popped 6 of the 8 floor joists simultaneously and split the rear wall at the corner seam with a crack that traveled from base to roofline in under a second. The table tilted. His tin plate slid 4 inches left and stopped against the raised edge. The candle in the center leaned, guttered, and held. Harlan sat completely still for 3 seconds, with his fork halfway to his mouth, listening. The Cimarron was no longer a background sound. It was the only sound, heavy and deliberate and close, carrying 3 weeks of Kansas rainfall in its current and depositing it, with considerable purpose, across his yard. He put the fork down and went to the door. The water was already past the fence line. Dark and fast, carrying sticks and matted grass and a weathered fence post he recognized by the notch cut in the top rail, a post he had driven into the eastern property corner himself 2 springs prior. The post was gone. The water had taken it the way the water was taking everything that was not anchored to something deeper than the basin's treacherous surface clay. From inside the barn came the sound he had been dreading since the first rain week. The short, hard percussion of iron-shod hooves striking wood planking in a rapid, irregular pattern. Not the lazy shifting of an animal resettling its weight. The specific escalating knock of an animal that has smelled water coming up through the floor, gaps and has begun to understand that standing still is no longer reasonable. That was Bob. Bob was a 12-year-old blue roan draft animal, 16 hands high and built across the chest like a double-wide fireplace, purchased for $31 from a departing homesteader outside Guthrie the previous autumn. He was not gentle. He was not particularly intelligent. But he could pull a stone boat loaded with 400 pounds of quarried limestone across broken ground for 6 hours on water and a handful of oats, and on the Cimarron River Basin in 1889. That capability was worth more than gentleness or intelligence combined. Bob was locked inside a barn with water coming up through the floor. Harlan looked back at the cabin. The floor was still tilted. The rear wall seam had opened to a gap he could fit 3 fingers through, and through that gap he could see the gray April sky. He looked at the foundation, the thing his neighbors had spent the better part of 2 years openly ridiculing, and felt something settle in his chest that lived in the specific territory of a man who made a decision nobody believed in, and is now watching that decision hold against everything the river has delivered. The foundation had not moved a single inch. Harlan Boggs had arrived in the Cimarron River Basin in the spring of 1887, carrying a used Studebaker wagon, 11 years of experience as a stonemason's apprentice, and a working knowledge of what water does to soil that most frontier men had never been forced to acquire. He filed on 160 acres along the river's north bank and began building immediately. What separated him from every other homesteader breaking ground that season was that he spent his first 6 weeks doing nothing but digging. His neighbors had considerable opinions about this. The Pruitt family, a quarter-mile east, watched from horseback and said nothing, which was its own kind of judgment. Old Swede Lindqvist across the river told him in careful English that a man who spent his building season underground was going to winter in a hole. The 3 Darnell brothers, who had framed and roofed their own cabin in 11 days using green-cut cottonwood lumber already warping at the window frames, rode by on a Thursday afternoon and asked whether Harlan was digging a foundation or a grave. Harlan thanked them for the question and kept digging. What he built was a rubble stone, footing 2 feet wide and 4 feet deep. Mortared with a lime mix he burned himself in a field kiln, using limestone quarried from a shelf outcropping half a mile upstream. 4 feet deep put him below the frost line, and, more critically, below the Cimarron Basin's notorious shrink-swell clay layer, a dark, dense stratum that absorbed water like raw fleece in wet seasons and cracked like fired ceramic in dry ones, shifting the foundations of every wood post structure within 5 miles at least once in living memory. He had tested the clay himself, cutting a column out with a spade and submerging it in a bucket overnight. By morning, it had expanded by nearly 1/3 of its original volume. He stood over that bucket for a long time doing arithmetic in his head. The rubble stone footing rested on the basin's underlying sandstone shelf, which did not swell, did not contract, did not concern itself with the Cimarron River's opinions about what the surrounding landscape should look like in April. It had taken 4 months to build and cost him the entire first growing season. He had eaten on credit through the winter of 1887, buying flour and salt pork from the Guthrie supply store on a running tab that made the store clerk visibly uncomfortable by February. He declined charity twice. He mortared stone through November with hands so cracked at the knuckles that they bled into the mix, wiped them on his trouser legs, and kept working. Now the water was in his yard and climbing, and Bob was hammering the barn door from the inside with the focused intensity of an animal that has decided cooperation is finished. Harlan pulled his boots on, picked up the iron pry bar leaning against the doorframe, and went out into the flood. The water was at his knees before he reached the barn door, not the shallow, slow-moving sheet of a field flood that a man could wade through without much concern. This was Cimarron water, brown and cold, and moving with the particular muscular authority of a river that has jumped its banks and is redistributing the landscape according to its own priorities. It carried silt and uprooted scrub brush and long ropes of matted dead grass that wrapped around Harlan's legs with each step and had to be kicked free. The footing beneath the surface was gone, not the hard-packed yard dirt he had walked every day for 2 years, but something soft and undermined, the shrink-swell clay already loosening in the saturation, shifting under his boot soles in a way that made each step a separate negotiation. He reached the barn door and drove the pry bar into the gap between door and frame. The door had swollen. 3 weeks of heavy rain had worked moisture into the cottonwood planking, the same green-cut cottonwood the Darnell brothers had used for their own structures, which Harlan had bought second-hand because barn construction did not require the precision of a foundation, and cottonwood was what the territory offered at a price he could manage. The planks had expanded across their width by nearly half an inch, enough to bind the door in its frame as thoroughly as if it had been nailed shut from the outside. Bob hit it from the inside At the same moment, Harlan hit it from the outside with the pry bar, and for a long second, the door held against both of them. Then the frame gave. The door swung outward, and Bob came through it at speed. 16 hands of panicked draft animal, moving with a purpose that did not include awareness of what was standing in the doorway. Harlan threw himself sideways against the barn wall and felt the displaced water from Bob's passage hit him like a thrown bucket as the animal plunged into the flooded yard, found his footing in the brown current, and stopped. Just stopped. Stood chest-deep in Cimarron floodwater, with his ears pinned flat and his nostrils working, and made no further movement, as if the act of escaping the barn had consumed his entire reserve of initiative, and he was now content to stand in a river and wait for further instructions. Harlan stood against the barn wall, with floodwater at his thighs, and took stock. Bob was out and standing. The immediate crisis was resolved. The secondary crisis was the tool cache, not the hand tools. Those he kept inside the cabin in a locked chest, a habit from his mason's apprenticeship, where unsecured tools had a way of disappearing permanently. The heavy equipment lived in the barn, the stone boat, the block and tackle rig he used to move quarried limestone, the 2 broad-faced chisels, and the hand-forged pitching hammer he had carried from Joplin, wrapped in oilcloth, and which could not be replaced in Oklahoma territory for any price he could currently afford. He went back into the barn through the open door, moving against the current, pushing steadily inward through the sill gap, and found the tool shelf by feel in the darkness. The chisels went into his coat pockets. The pitching hammer he gripped in his right hand, 8 pounds of hand-forged iron with a hickory handle worn smooth at the grip from 11 years of daily use, the weight of it familiar enough that holding it in a flooding barn in the dark felt, briefly and absurdly, like being back at the quarry face on an ordinary morning. The block and tackle he unhooked from the ceiling beam and slung over his left shoulder. The stone boat he left. It was iron. It would not float. It would rust, which was a problem for after the river made up its mind about his property. He came back out and looked east. The Pruitt cabin sat a quarter-mile away across the flooded basin, and even at that distance, and in that light, Harlan could see something was wrong with its roofline. The horizontal was gone. The structure was listing badly to the south, one corner visibly dropped, the whole frame torquing on its failed surface, footing the way a green-cut cottonwood table torques when one leg gives, slowly at first, then with increasing commitment. The Pruitts had set their foundation posts 18 inches into the masse the shrink-swell clay. The clay had absorbed 3 weeks of Kansas rainfall and was delivering its verdict with the impersonal efficiency of a material that has no opinion about who built on it or why. Harlan tied Bob's lead rope to the iron anchor ring mortared into the cabin's foundation stone and went inside. The stove was holding heat from the morning fire, not enough warmth to feel immediately, but enough to confirm the flue pipe was intact and the firebox undamaged. He fed it kindling and 2 splits of dry pine from the stack beside the south wall and stood over it with both hands extended, watching the draft pull the flame asim upward in a clean, steady column. The foundation beneath him was solid and level. The floor was still tilted from the joist failure, but the walls above it were plumb. He could see it in the door frame, in the window frame, in the way the ceiling line held true across its full span. A tilted floor was a repair job. Plumb walls on a solid foundation were a home. He had been inside 4 minutes when the voice reached him through the south wall. Ragged and high, and stripped of everything except the specific urgency of someone who has passed through fear into the place beyond it, where only volume matters. It came from the direction of the Pruitt place, carried across the flooded basin on the same northwest wind that was pushing the current against his foundation stones, and it had the quality of a sound that had already been going for some time before he heard it. He was back at the door before he had consciously decided to move. The rope was on the peg where he always kept it. 30 feet of half-inch hemp, stiff with age but intact, coiled in the figure-8 pattern his old foreman at the quarry had drilled into him until it was reflex. He looped it twice across his chest, pulled the door shut behind him, and waded back out into the Cimarron's dark water. Bob watched him go with the expression of an animal that has strong reservations, but lacks the vocabulary to register them formally. The water was higher than when he had come in. It was still rising. He waded east into the dark toward the voice and did not look back. Dale Pruitt said later that he heard his wife's voice stop mid-call and did not know for 6 hours whether that meant she had been found, or whether it meant something he could not bring himself to name. He was on high ground a mile north of the basin when the Cimarron jumped its banks, having ridden out before the worst of it to check the fence line on his northern quarter, and found his horse lame in a hidden wash before he could turn back. He had spent the night on a limestone shelf above the flood line with his lame horse and his imagination had not been kind to him. He had watched the water spread across the basin floor in the dark, the way ink spreads across wet paper, slow at the edges, then sudden at the center, and he had done the arithmetic of his cabin's foundation posts and the shrink-swell clay, and arrived at conclusions he could not argue his way out of, no matter how hard he tried. He came down off the limestone shelf at first gray light and walked a mile through 4 inches of receding water with a lame horse at his shoulder and the particular dread of a man who has been wrong about something important and knows it and cannot yet see how wrong. He smelled the pine smoke before he saw the cabin. Not his cabin. His cabin was a dark shape listing 30 degrees to the south on its collapsed corner, the roofline permanently kinked, one wall bowed outward along its full height, where the frame had racked in the clay shift. The chimney had separated from the wall at the base and stood at an angle that made it appear to be leaning away from the wreckage out of embarrassment. There was no smoke from that chimney. There was nothing salvageable in that structure that Dale Pruitt could see from 50 yards away in the gray morning light. The smoke was coming from Harlan's cabin. Dale stood at the edge of what had been Harlan's yard fence and looked at the structure for a long time. The walls were plumb. The roofline was level and unbroken. The foundation stones at the visible corners sat exactly as they had sat before the flood, the mortared face unmarked, the courses undisturbed, the whole assembly resting on its sandstone shelf with the composed indifference of something that had watched an entire river run across its feet and had found the experience unremarkable. He went to the door and knocked. Harlan opened it and stepped back without a word, and Dale walked into warmth so immediate and complete after the cold, wet dark of the past 8 hours that he stopped moving just inside the threshold and stood there for a moment doing nothing at all. His children were on the floor beside the stove, wrapped in dry blankets, both asleep. Curtis had his knees pulled to his chest and one hand tucked under his cheek. Nora had her head on her brother's shoulder. Margaret sat in the chair beside them, with her eyes closed and her hands folded in her lap, and her wet hair beginning to dry at the ends from the stove's heat. Dale looked at his family for a long time. Then he sat down at Harlan's table and put both hands flat on the surface and stared at them. Harlan poured coffee from the pot on the stove and set the cup in front of him and sat down across the table and said nothing 'cause there was nothing useful to say, and Harlan Boggs had never been a man who filled silence with noise just to fill it. The coffee was hot and black, and Dale drank half of it before he spoke. He asked what had happened. Harlan told him in plain sequence without drama or embellishment. The voice across the water, the rope, the 3 crossings, the children first, then Margaret on her own power, the stove already built to heat by the time they arrived. He left out the parts where the current had taken him to one knee, because those parts were not relevant to the outcome, and the outcome was the only part that mattered now. Dale listened without interrupting. When Harlan finished, Dale picked up his coffee cup and held it in both hands and looked at the table again. Outside, Bob shifted his weight at the foundation ring. The water around his hooves was down to 2 inches and still dropping. The Cimarron was pulling back across the basin with the same slow, deliberate authority with which it had arrived, leaving behind a landscape of flattened grass and deposited silt, and the particular gray-brown film that coats everything a flood touches and takes 3 days of dry weather to fully disappear. The Darnell brothers rode by at mid-morning, all 3 of them picking their way through the receding water on horseback, assessing the basin damage with the careful eyes of men calculating their own losses against their neighbors. They stopped at Harlan's yard line and looked at the cabin. They looked at the foundation. They looked at the Pruitt structure a quarter-mile east, collapsed on its corner, beyond repair. The oldest Darnell brother, whose name was Court, and who had been the one to ask whether Harlan was digging a foundation or a grave, sat on his horse for a full minute without speaking. Then he asked Harlan how deep the footing ran. 4 feet, Harlan told him. Rubble stone on sandstone shelf. Lime mortar burned on site. Court Darnell looked at the foundation stones one more time. He looked at his brothers. He looked back at Harlan with the expression of a man who has held a specific opinion for 2 years and is in the process of quietly retiring it without ceremony. He asked how long it would take to teach a man to burn a lime kiln. Harlan told him 3 weeks for the burn and another month to build the footing properly if the man was willing to work through it without cutting corners. He said the limestone outcropping half a mile upstream had enough material for 4 foundations if a man quarried it right, and that he had 2 broad chisels and a pitching hammer and was willing to show anyone who asked how to use them correctly. Court Darnell nodded once and said he would be back in 3 weeks. He rode off with his brothers without further conversation, which was the Darnell way of indicating that a matter had been settled. Dale Pruitt spent 2 days in Harlan's cabin while the basin dried and the water finished its retreat. On the morning of the 3rd day, he walked to the limestone outcropping with Harlan and stood at the quarry's face and watched Harlan set the first chisel point against the rock and drive it with the pitching hammer in the short, controlled stroke of a man who has done this 10,000 times and knows exactly how much force the stone requires and how much it will not tolerate. Dale picked up the second chisel and set it against the rock face 6 inches from Harlan's and looked at him. Harlan showed him the angle. Dale adjusted. Harlan nodded. Dale drove the chisel into the limestone with a stroke that was uncertain and too hard, and chipped a piece off the face that went nowhere useful. He reset the chisel, drove it again. The second stroke was better. The third was better than that. They quarried stone for 4 hours that morning without speaking much. The Cimarron ran at its normal level below them, clear and unremarkable in the late April light, giving no indication whatsoever that it had recently redistributed a significant portion of the basin's geography. A red-tailed hawk worked the updraft above the limestone shelf, circling without apparent purpose, patient in the way that things are patient when they are not in a hurry and have no reason to be. Dale Pruitt broke ground on his new foundation that same week. He dug 4 feet down through the shrink-swell clay to the sandstone shelf below, the way Harlan had shown him, and he did not stop digging until he hit stone that did not move when he drove the bar against it. It took him 6 weeks. He burned his own lime kiln. He mortared his own rubble stone, footing in November, with hands that blistered and cracked and bled into the mix the same way Harlan's had bled 2 years before. The new Pruitt cabin stood on that foundation for 41 years. The Cimarron flooded the basin 4 more times before the century turned. Each time, the structures that sat on surface footings in the shrink-swell clay shifted or collapsed, or were simply abandoned by families who had run out of the particular kind of stubbornness required to rebuild the same wrong thing a 3rd and 4th time. Each time, Harlan's cabin sat on its sandstone shelf and watched the water come and watched the water go, and remained exactly as plumb and level as the morning he had finished the last course of stone, and stepped back and looked at what 2 years of work and one very specific idea had produced. Bob lived to 17. He pulled stone for every foundation Harlan built in the Cimarron Basin after the flood of 1889, which numbered 11 before Harlan's hands got too stiff in the winters to swing the pitching hammer with the control the work required. He was not gentle to the end. He was not intelligent, but he worked without complaint in conditions that would have broken a lesser animal. And Harlan fed him well and kept his shoes tight and never asked more of him than the work demanded. That was on the Cimarron River Basin in the last decade of the 19th century, as close to a fair arrangement as most relationships got.